So let's jump ahead to the communal formation, which is much more of a distinctive Wesleyan element. Methodism started as an orderly pursuit of spiritual formation. This continued to define Wesleyan church structure throughout its formative decades and beyond. In fact, that's what gave it its name. There was a methods to spiritual growth, so they were called Methodists. Wesley did not like that name. Wesley did not choose that name, but it was a name that stuck, and so Wesley acknowledged the fact that that's what people were known as, so used it, but that was not his preferred term. But what we can say is this scaling structure of orderly spiritual formation is probably the most defining aspect of Wesleyan ecclesiology. Everything else we can see overlapping across the different ecclesial structures and diversity within the tradition. But this is really what made Methodists Methodists. For Wesley, the nature of the Christian faith is communal. That is what he means by a social gospel. As he once put it, holy solitaries is a phrase no more consistent with the gospel than holy adulterers. There's no semblance of the idea that you could be a Christian and not participate in a Christian community. As such, there was a system of accountability for members that fostered growth in holiness in all meetings. So this was a way of taking people from hearing, say, a field preaching or a revival pastor and hearing this message and saying yes to Jesus, being drawn in. And there was a clear, orderly path of development and community and discussions that helped walk people into a growing relationship with Christ and connection and involvement with the Spirit. Such scaled approaches were able to provide personal accountability, vulnerability, formation, and examples and opportunities. Some larger structures that help the big parts, we can talk about conferences, overarching organizational meeting in which society leaders gathered to discuss issues and learn from each other. So these were like the leaders from all the different churches would gather together and talk about things. Wesley saw the agenda as being about what to teach, how to teach, what to do. They also provided a place for mutual encouragement among leaders and to discuss strategies for expansion. The annual conference or the quadrannual conference is, depending on the denomination, these are where people from all over a certain country come together or region. There also you have what's called connections. This was the preferred term for a lot of early Wesleyan groups. It's really equivalent to denomination, how we would term it, but it was an identifiable unity of congregations and conferences that were shared. Now, Thomas Coke and some others, they didn't always like the term church, like the Wesleyan church, especially Luther Lee, who we'll talk about in a little bit. He said, this isn't a church. So we can't call it the Wesleyan Church because these are just a gathering of different churches who are connected to each other. So the term connection became a way of symbolizing these are churches that are involved with each other, but not themselves formal churches as a whole. The movement was then developed to connect people from the larger scale into the smaller. In terms of the smaller scale, there's three main categories. First, societies. These are the communities that developed under the overall teaching. So we might call them churches, and we probably would today, it would be equivalent to that, but the Wesleys did not see these as having an independent ecclesial role again. So members were supposed to attend weekly Anglican churches still. So they were a form of what we would call church, and they certainly morphed into the churches in America and then later in Britain and elsewhere. They were intended as a renewal movement within the Anglican Church and oriented around wider participation and contribution from lay participants. So it really was a way of giving the people a path to their own spiritual contribution and contribute to each other and using their gifts in a way that wasn't happening within the broader conventional churches. They met for singing, for prayer, and for preaching. Next, lower down. So classes. These are oriented towards pastoral care for one another within the larger structure of society. Consisted of about a dozen participants oriented towards prayer and mutual encouragement. So we might call this a small group. Class participation was mandatory as part of being in a society. This was required. And then the smallest group was called bands. This was voluntary small groups of 3 to 4 who met for mutual accountability. They were divided by gender, age, and marital status. Those divisions weren't in the societies or the classes, but because of the nature of these bands, this is a way of making sure the accountability stayed honest and vulnerable. Each weekly meeting, participants asked 5 questions of one another. 1. What known sins have you committed since our last meeting? 2. What temptations have you met with? 3. How were you delivered? 4. What have you thought, said, or done of which you doubt whether it be sin or not? 5. Have you done nothing you desire to keep secret? Now, as we talked about in the discussion on sin, the orientation here was not confession just to get it off your chest, nor was this a way of trying to excuse guilt. Notice how if you see it as a way of just trying to excise guilt, you don't have to go into details. If you see this more as confession of symptoms, seeing sin as indications of problems, and seeing sin as also something that could have resolution. So these were ways of discussing with one another what's going on, where's the, we can say, moral or ethical or spiritual sickness in your life, and finding a group of people who are committed to helping each other walk through it and providing accountability and insight and wisdom and sharing as part of the process.